Welcome to Whiskey Lore. I'm Drew Hanisch. And I got a really fun episode for you here. I love when I get a guest on that can tell some really good stories. And this is a man who has seen Memphis in its rebirth. He started with Beale Street back in 1984, and back then it was basically locked off to the world. And it's only recently, over the last couple of decades, really returned to being a place that people gather and people are listening to music and getting into blues and enjoying the atmosphere. And it's great to see the rebirth down there. He's going to take us through some of that. We're going to talk about how the city was founded over drinks. At least that's the way the myth goes. We're going to also talk about the huge number of saloons they had in Memphis back during Prohibition. We'll talk about the purpose of a juke joint, which we're going to get more into in my story episode coming up on Monday. And we'll talk about the juke joint that brought us the Memphis blues. And we'll take a look at Beale Street back in the 1920s. It's all coming up here from we're upstairs at the Peabody Hotel. The Peabody Hotel is a classic 1920s Art Deco hotel. If you've never seen it before and you're in Memphis, you should stop in and just take a look at the lobby, see the ducks. Yes, there are ducks in the lobby of the Peabody. So we'll talk about that later on. But right now, let's jump into our episode with Jimmy Rout, the Shelby County Historian, here on Whiskey Lore. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, because you said that you actually worked for Beale Street and getting some of that history out.
Yes, I started out, when I graduated from college, I was a communications theater major. And so I knew I wanted to do something that allowed me to be a part of, not just be in an office sitting behind a desk. And our family friend was the developer of Beale Street, John Elkington.
Okay.
And so I told him, I said, I love to do things. I love to plan things and do things. And he said, well, come work for us for the summer, which ended up being for 3 years. So I was the assistant marketing director for Beale Street. And at that time, Beale Street had been open 3 years. Mm-hmm. There was the Rum Boogie Cafe that had just opened and a few other places. On Fridays and Saturday nights, in order to get blues musicians to play on this new Beale Street, I would go to the bank and get $300 worth of $20 bills. And I would go up the street to where there was a retirement home, still there, just past that church. Yeah. And I would say, I'll pay you $20 to play blues on Beale Street.
Wow.
So that, because it was all fresh and new, beautiful new cobblestones, new buildings, in order to get musicians to come back to Beale Street to play.
What year time period?
84, 85.
Okay.
Yeah. And 81 is really when it started, the renovation started in the new buildings where the backs of the buildings were all done because the facades are all historic. Yeah. But it does have a great history. Beale Street was really the soul of the black community in Memphis, and the musicians particularly. And the first two blocks were really the businesses. Mm-hmm. And the immigrants, a lot of the Jewish families in Memphis had businesses there, also pawn shops, and there was the great influx of our Chinese population. Chop Suey was down there, a restaurant called Chop Suey, and they had several laundries were down there. And it really was a very ecumenical society of immigrants, a real melting pot. And then W.C. Handy talks about how when he came here, and he was the son, just first generation out of his parents were slaves. So, he came here and it was like he sees Beale Street, and Pee Wee's Saloon was on Beale Street. Mm-hmm. And Pee Wee had come to Memphis in the 1880s as a 10-year-old boy, hobo, off of a train. And dirty and muddy, and W.C. Handy talks about it in his book, how he got off the train and he went to the Bottoms, the Gayuso Bottoms, which is where Beale Street's built over, and he did a little spit bath, cleaned himself up, and then he found a little crap game, and he had 10 cents. Mm-hmm. And he was playing cards and craps, and he won enough money to be able to go get a hotel room that night for 75 cents or whatever.
Wow.
And then he cleaned up and he would gamble every day. And then he got a job. And by the 1910, I think it was, he owned a saloon on Beale Street.
Wow.
So
nice.
Yeah, it is nice. It is.
Yeah. Were they gambling in there? Was did gambling come along with him?
Now, I've not heard there was, but you and I both know. Anytime you've got alcohol and you've got men who are bored, you're going to have a little wagering going on.
Yeah.
So I'm sure in the background there always was. But it did become I guess because it was where it was on Beale Street, or maybe it was the largest. It's where all the blues musicians tended to hang out. One thinks nowadays, after hours, where do bands go? They have to unwind. Yeah. So I've always, in reading the stories about Pee Wee's Saloon, I'm kind of imagining that's where those musicians went when they unwound at night. And W.C. Handy says that it was at the cigar counter, because he sold cigars there too. At the cigar counter is when he wrote out the Memphis Blues.
Oh, wow.
It was right there on that cigar counter.
And that song actually has another title.
It does, Mr. Crump's Blues, or Mr. Crump.
Yeah.
He wrote it, and he was not really a proponent of Mr. Crump's, but Mr. Crump was a big promoter himself, and anytime your name, no matter if it's good or bad, just got your name out there. It was originally Mr. Crump's Blues, but then it was later changed to the Memphis Blues.
Okay.
And W.C. didn't invent, of course, the blues.
Right.
But he was the first to publish.
He came up through Mississippi. He was from Alabama. I think, originally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Florence, Alabama.
Yeah. But there was an area, because ragtime would have been the music that was popular, I guess. As I understand it, he was actually at the World's Fair in 1893 and was a musician, and likely he was playing ragtime music at that time.
But we have to remember, as I said, he's just first generation from the slaves, so he had that ragtime and all, but he had to have heard at home some good Negro spirituals. So music was probably ingrained in him. That whole Mississippi Delta. Florence, Alabama is also where Sam Phillips, by the way, is from, who discovered Elvis. But the whole Mississippi Delta, all those blues, is Clarksdale, Clarksville, all those places down in there, the crossroads and all. They all kind of come from, you can if you close your eyes and you think about it, you can hear the people in the fields at the end of the day, and they're tired and they're communicating, singing those black Negro spirituals. And then as the decades go by and they gain their emancipation, and then they're going and picking up other music, all of that musical heritage all stems back from those Negro spirituals and in the churches. Yeah. So it's just a rich area full of a music history.
So one of the terms that I'm following here is the term juke joint.
Yes.
And the idea of the juke joint, as I understand it, goes all the way back into slavery, that was kind of there were collecting places for the slaves to have their time away from their toil, and how that all evolved. I mean, is that... what's interesting is we take these words like that, or we take those concepts, and then we kind of forget that they have this...
an origin,
exactly, that goes all the way back. Because you'll see juke joints in movies, and they're, sometimes they're out in the country, but then you'll also hear people talking about them like they were in town, and this was just kind of like a regular bar that
and
you
they're more
went
like
to.
A prop in that situation. They're almost like just a character or a prop.
Yeah.
Well, when I think about juke joints, I think exactly like you said, they evolve because they're a sanctuary. They're a place you can go, forget about the day, forget about the family, forget about the job, forget about the problems. You just relax. And in many cases, it helped to have a little whiskey to help relax. And we all know what happens when we have a little whiskey, conversation, sing-alongs, music, you want to dance. And so the juke joint really became a place where all inhibitions were gone. You could be yourself, where there was no master telling you what to do, no wife telling you what to do.
Right.
Nothing. It just was a place to be you. I think nowadays, I look at the parallel nowadays, and I think it's what we call dive joints. When you want to go to a dive, why do you want to go? Because you don't want to worry about wearing the right clothes. You don't want to worry about barbecue sauce on your shirt. You just want to relax,
Yeah, absolutely. So did that come into the city at all?
It did. And you got to remember Memphis. Memphis is on the river. So Shelby County was founded. Shelby County, the largest county in Tennessee. Memphis, the largest of our 7 municipalities, was on the river. Great commerce. 1819 is when it was chartered by the state. After the Indian secession, they bought the Chickasaw lands. And one of the great tavern whiskey stories is that the founding fathers, Andrew Jackson and John Overton and James Winchester, met in a bar, Beale Tavern, and they laid out the city of Memphis. Well, the only problem with that is none of the 3 founders was ever in the city at the same time. And in 1819, the Beale Tavern wasn't even in existence yet.
Wow. Yeah.
Now the Irishman Patty Marr that had the Beale Tavern, he was here in like the 1814s. He had a boarding house, and so very possibly one of them stayed there and all. But we were a rowdy river town. So you can imagine in the 1800s those boats coming up and down the river. They were not what you call the country club set. So as they would come off the river, who knows how long they'd been on that river, they'd come up, the first thing they'd get their wages. What do they want to do? They want to drink, So Memphis always had a lot of bars and places where you could go to find things to drink. And Beale Tavern was one of the ones that was there for a long time in downtown Memphis. And as time continues to go on, by the time that Prohibition comes at 1900, there were like 600 of these places where you could go to get a drink.
Wow.
Now whether they were all legal or whether they were not,
right.
You had to imagine. And then I was reading recently about the Prohibition, is that once the national prohibition went in, 300 more were discovered because everyone's wanting to just kind of do it because you can't do it.
Right.
You just tell somebody you can't drink. What are you going to do? You're going to go drink. So I think Memphis has always been a lively town.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that we don't have chronicled perhaps all the most interesting juke joints or dives, but there had to be a lot of back rooms, backs of stores, backs of theaters after a theatrical production where people were enjoying, and it was their job joint, their individual. I do have a lady who's now in her 80s, and she recently told me that her first job, and she was 18 or 19 years old, in the late 60s, she worked at a hospital in the rural Shelby County called Oakville Hospital. And that on Friday nights, behind the hospital, there was a row of about 7 shotgun buildings. They had been shotgun houses. But there was a man, Mr. Tate, she said, who lived in one of those houses. And she said, you could be assured that on Friday night, after our shift, we'd go down there, and it was like being, she said, in the best little juke joint in town. She said, we could all relax after a busy week, and we could all have a little bite and have a little nip and have a little dance. So here again, juke joints, they're a sanctuary, a place to escape and be yourself.
Yeah. So anything that we would see these days, I mean, it's what would be the last juke joint we probably would have seen in this area, or about what time probably did they fade away, or do we still have them but they're kind of commercialized?
Well, we do still have them. There's a couple whose, of course, their names escape me at the moment, but there's a couple of them right now. There's a great, and I've noticed that juke joints too, I think they had a transition when country music started to come into mainstream, because you have a lot of juke joints that are all country themed.
Okay.
So do you really call them juke joints,
right,
or are they country dives? It's the same principle.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but it's a different musical theme there. The thematics are different. There's a great one called Hernando's Hideaway. Isn't that great?
I was going to say there was a song called Hernando's Hideaway.
There was. And there is, as we do a historical research on that place for a historical marker, it's a 50-50. Did that lead into the name because it was in the movie?
Yeah.
Or that it's on Hernando Road and people used to use it. So perhaps it was an influence and all. It's a great dive. It's a great juke joint. It's still got the low ceilings, and it's still packed with cigarette smoke, even in this day and age. And you can smell, your feet stick to the floor. It's great,
oh, man.
You know?
Yeah.
And there's always good live music. And it's from people that you love the music, but you never heard of the recording artist, you know, because they're not a recording artist.
Yeah.
They're just an individual. And then there's a lot of, we're a university town. We've got some great universities here. So there's a lot of taverns. Alex Tavern near Rhodes College here. Great, you know, after 11 o'clock at night, you'll find great live music, and the whiskey is flowing, and the lights are dark, and it's more like what a juke joint would be. And then there's some who just kind of, one or two of them that are around because it's important you have one, and it's a commercial success, and that's why they do it.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting ones is called Ernestine and Hazel's. And it's just south of where we are here at the Peabody Hotel on South Main, not too far from the Lorraine Hotel where Dr. King was assassinated. Ernestine and Hazel's was across the street from a train station, our Union Station, and it was a brothel. And it was owned by two, I think they're two sisters, Ernestine and Hazel. And, you know, they'd come downstairs, you'd have your juke joint, and then upstairs there were other pleasures you could partake of and all. It's still alive and going. Not the upstairs portion of the business, but it still is a great weekend place where you can see all sorts of an eclectic crowd. And a great jukebox. Doesn't have live music, but it has a great jukebox, great greasy hamburgers, great whiskey and draft beer, and it's a good place to be. So juke joints are very important, very, very important. I think they're a release for humanity.
So would you say that Beale Street in, say, the 1920s and 30s, probably more so the 20s when it was legal and you could have it out front, was closer to the juke joint types of establishments, or closer to, like, for instance, when I go out to a jazz club and it's, you know, you'll be drinking scotch there. It's a more almost trying to be a more upper class kind of a thing. What was Beale Street's feel back then?
I think Beale Street was not that high end. I think that there were clubs. There was Club Handy. There was the Palace Theater. There were some that in the earlier parts of the evening, sure, yeah, they were. You could take a date. And there might be a black band. There might be a W.C. Handy's band there, or some other band might be there. And it would be a nice cordial place. You could take a date and you could have a great time. And then as the evening progressed, there was activity up until the wee hours of the morning, the stories you can read, people still walking the streets of Beale Street in the 20s and 30s as if it was 12 o'clock noon because it was so busy. So you have to imagine, is it because maybe people were getting off work, they'd come for the latter part of the shift? But it's always been colorful. So probably the most enjoyable time of Beale Street would be at the evening time when it was more the juke joint feeling.
Yeah.
But it did have the nice places where you could take a date and have a nice evening out. And maybe if you had a fun date, you'd want to stay till the latter part of the night and enjoy the juking in the joint.
Right. So the other thing about Memphis that I just learned, I didn't know a lot about the back history, but there was a yellow fever epidemic here. Three, okay. And a lot of that was based around the fact that they didn't really have a good water system here, and people were drinking out of the Mississippi River, and how good is that going to be? and
well, no, I've never tried it, Dennis, so I'm not sure about
sewage and the rest. It's probably not the greatest in the world, and it really changed the makeup of the people of Memphis because the upper class moved out because they could afford to.
And not just the upper class. So we did not have a drainage system, and the Gayoso Bayou, it kind of ends at Beale Street. Mm-hmm. So as things were built, they filled in the bayou, and of course it was built on top of it. And it wasn't so much, I don't think, drinking from the river as disposing of the sewage and all the waste into the community. And they still, remember, they didn't realize mosquitoes were the transmission for it. When you've got a river which has little tributaries, the Loosahatchee River and the bayou, and then you've got other standing sewage waters, you're going to have a problem with that. Well, what happened during the yellow fever, Memphis was really settled by a huge amount of Germans. We had a great influx of Germans, and they brought in wonderful theater and opera and wonderful engineering and doctors and architects, some of the earliest ones. And then we had a great Italian influx. But when the yellow fever came, they fled.
Okay.
Not to come back.
Yeah.
So Memphis really, their trajectory as really maybe a high-end, nice East Coast version on the Mississippi River, it left when the great immigrants who came from Europe, and they knew the great opera houses and all. And then, of course, being in the Delta after emancipation, all of this works. 1870s, our last epidemic of the yellow fever, we were a huge congregating city for all of the emancipated slaves because we were so close by, you know. And so we still had a great amount of some families that stuck it out who were able to go out in the country during the yellow fever and come back. But yeah, the demographics in it changed. And remember too, during yellow fever and before, you drank liquor and whiskey because it was safe.
Yeah.
That was a great reason to, you know.
Yeah.
And so things changed a little bit after that. But no, we've always had a great diverse period. And I always wonder what would have happened if the yellow fever hadn't come with our great immigrant population.
Memphis was what, the second biggest city in the South at that time?
It was busiest before the war, and it was the busiest after the war. We kind of were, you know, we seceded, the last to secede and the first to get back into the Union, because we're kind of on that middle. People say, well, Tennessee's not the South. And I said, well, it's strictly not the North, you know, so where is it and all?
Yeah.
So we were spared lots of destruction. But yeah, it's we were saved a lot, and we had a lot of Union soldiers who have there's some great Union stories and diaries about them going to the Juke Joints and drinking here in town, the camps.
Yeah,
you know, so there's always whiskey.
Well, and this area was also heavily Irish.
Very much. The whole police department was Irish.
So I can draw some correlations between New York and how Tammany Hall ran in New York, and it sounds like there was a bit of that kind of the spoils system and the rest going on here as well, patronage and all of that. And so this is where we get to a guy named Boss Crump. So
E.H. Crump, Edward Hull Crump.
Talk a little bit about how he came up and his ties to whiskey, because this is a very interesting
it is
story.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and it's interesting. As you and I have talked today, kind of like the Delta, the heart of the Delta is said to be in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel, because anybody who's everybody comes to the Peabody. I now believe that all roads lead to Memphis, no matter where you are in the world. All roads lead to Memphis. So Edward Hull Crump was from Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ironically, the same place Ida B. Wells was from. Okay. As we've spoken earlier about Ida B. But he came to Memphis and was a young businessman and ingratiated himself with realizing there was change and opportunity here, and ran for public office and in the early 1900s. And he did run, but then as Prohibition came around, saloons played a big part in elections because they were polling places also So you could get your ballot there and fill your ballot out. Well, now, if you're a politician like Edward Hull Crump, E.H. Crump, you're, whoa, I got a lot of people that go to the bar. They're my friends. They vote for me. If we don't have liquor to drink, where am I going to make sure I get my votes, So he wasn't against it. He wasn't for it. He just kind of turned his back on it. Well, he was having a bit of a political rivalry with the governor at the time, Malcolm Patterson. And Malcolm Patterson, he was a thorn in his flesh, Crump was. And he thought, what can I do? I know what I'm going to do. And he got the legislators at the time to come up with what's called the Tennessee ouster law. And what it says was, and there's a couple of different categories, but one of them is if the elected official does not enact the laws of the state, the federal, the local, they can be ousted from office. It passed the legislature, and lo and behold, they accused Mayor Crump of not enforcing the prohibition laws. Well, he wasn't going to enforce them. So as they came down to let him know, you're about to be ousted, he resigned from office with like a year left in his term. And I think that's probably, and this is an assumption, but you think about it. So if you're humiliated, if you want to call it humiliation, if you thought, darn it, he got me. How do I keep from doing that? I'll develop a power base, but I won't be elected. And that's exactly what he did. He became a kingmaker. But the Tennessee ouster law kind of came out of Prohibition. And I really had not known until a couple of weeks ago when you and I had taught that saloons were such a big part of the balloting system. Which makes perfect sense. Maybe we got to try it now.
Well, we talk about our forefathers, and I'm going to build an episode around this one of these days. I remember reading a book on James Madison, and James Madison, one of the things he didn't really appreciate when he ran for Congress was that he had to go out to the polling places and promise alcohol to people. And back then, they used to just vote open. They would say who they were voting for. So you hand them a cup of whiskey on their way out when they say you, and so all of a sudden people are seeing that and everybody's coming in voting for you. So
now the same lady I told you about who told me the Juke Joints story, Miss Mary Mitchell, she's a historian, a black historian, and she lives in Orange Mound, which is the oldest African-American dedicated neighborhood in the United States of America. It was created and built and designed just for blacks by blacks in 1919. She tells me the story about when her father in the 40s, when she'd get him by the hand and he'd say, I got a call or got notice that my shipment's in and down at the grocery, at the sundry store. They were just blue-collar working black folk. They didn't have no shipments coming in. What are you talking about? They'd go down there, and Mr. Crump's deliveries were there. A fifth of bourbon for every man in the polling place. And you'd go pick up your bourbon, and you'd come back and she asked her Daddy, why is Mr. Crump giving you liquor? He says, because he wants me to vote for him. She would say, are you going to vote for him just because of that? And she'd say, I can remember he'd look down at me and he'd say, nobody knows who a man votes for when he marks that ballot. Well, what he didn't know is probably that the Crump did. They tallied every one, and they kept little cards and all. But here again, he was buying the whiskey, and he'd buy watermelons. I mean, it just would depend. But you'd get the votes. So the alcohol in the saloons, they were really, really an important part of the voting process, which makes sense if you think about it. When communities don't have, early on, particularly 1800s, they don't have a lot of money. They may not have big fancy courthouses. They've just started. They don't have big churches. Where do people congregate? They're always at a bar, at a saloon. So it makes sense when you think about it rationally.
That Boss Crump was a really interesting character. He was in town all the way through the 1950s and was kind of the man pulling the strings behind the scenes all the way up until he died. And Memphis has a very interesting history, which we'll go into in the next episode. Also going to talk a little bit more about the Peabody Hotel.
It's easy to go back in time in buildings like this and to try to imagine what things were. And like I said, the saying is, the Delta begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel. And so happy hour in the Peabody lobby is very happy indeed. The player piano and the ducks in there and splashing around.
Nice.
It's always a good time.
Yeah. So we'll dig a little bit more into the story of the ducks because they originated from somewhere and from quite a long time ago. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about Graceland and what almost happened to it after Elvis died. And we'll also get into talking about a couple of controversial things that might get a little agitation out of people from Cleveland, Kansas City, and Detroit. I know part of it, I'm from Detroit, so I know part of it made me go, okay, all right, whatever. So we're going to get into that. That's all coming up in the next episode, which is available to you if you are a Whiskey Lore Society patron, which means that you need to go to patreon.com/whiskey-lore, and for as little as $5 a month, you'll get a chance to hear all of the second halves of these interviews that we've been doing over the last couple of weeks. And some great material in these, and I really want you to get a chance to hear those. And you're going to help out an independent podcast, and we'll get you some other stuff down the road as well, along with that bonus content. Got big plans coming up for the Whiskey Lore Society. Want to send a big thank you out to the team over at Blue Note Bourbon, BR Distilling, and they were the ones that introduced me to Jimmy. And Jimmy, like I say, great storyteller, and had a lot of fun discussing all Memphis history and Juke Joints, whiskey, and much more. Whiskey Lore is a production of Travel Fuels Life, LLC. You can find show notes, transcripts, and more at whiskey-lore.com/episodes. I'm Drew Hanisch, and until next time, cheers and slàinte mhath.